The year was 1874, and the Kansas wind carried with it the bitter smell of drought and dust. The Whitmore farm had once been a patch of promise, acres of golden wheat stretching toward the horizon. But now it lay cracked and hungry, like the rest of the frontier. The cattle had died one by one, the well had gone dry, and Clara Whitmore's father had grown older in the span of a single season. Clara stood by the small cabin window that morning, staring at the single piece of paper that would decide her fate. The letter bore the handwriting of the trading post owner in Santa Fe, a marriage contract of sorts. The words were formal, almost businesslike, as if they were describing the purchase of land, not the fate of a young woman, Miss Clara Whitmore, aged 19, to be wed to Taza, an Apache man, in the interests of good faith and peace between peoples. Her father's signature already marked the bottom in shaky ink. He had signed away her freedom for the promise of cleared debt and safe passage through Apache land for his cattle trade, though there were no cattle left now. "Clara," he said softly, not daring to meet her eyes. "It's the only way. Mr. Raleigh says the tribe will keep the truce if the marriage goes through. We can't afford another winter like this. You know that." She wanted to shout that she was not a treaty, that she was not some coin to be exchanged for peace. But when she saw his trembling hands and the gray in his beard that had not been there last spring, her anger faltered. He looked like a man defeated long before this decision. Her mother had died the previous year of fever, and with her passing, something in the household had gone quiet, as if laughter itself had been packed away in the coffin. Clara had been the light then, the one who sang while she washed clothes by the creek, who read worn Bible verses aloud at night. But since the letter came, she had not sung once. That morning she packed her mother's locket, the only thing she refused to leave behind. Inside it was a curl of her mother's hair, and on the back, faintly engraved, the words, "For strength." By noon, the wagon was ready. The driver, a grizzled man with one eye and no sense of pity, loaded her small trunk with a grunt. Her father helped her up, his hands trembling as he tried to offer comfort. "You'll be treated well, Clara," he murmured. "They say this Taza is a good man, fair." "An Apache," she whispered. The word felt foreign on her tongue, not cruel but heavy with everything she'd been told to fear. He looked at her then, finally meeting her eyes. "Fairer than most white men I've met," he said quietly. "Don't let the stories fill your head." But the stories had filled her head. Tales of raids, of scalps, of fires in the night. She had heard them whispered by women in town, by preachers who claimed the Apache were heathens without souls. Yet a small treacherous thought began to bloom within her as the wagon rolled away. What if those stories were only half true? The road stretched long and empty before her. The wind whipped her bonnet ties loose, sending her hair flying, and the endless prairie rolled by, a sea of yellow and gold under a pale autumn sun. Each mile carried her further from everything familiar, further from her girlhood dreams of love, of choice. Sometimes, she would close her eyes and imagine the life she was meant to have, a modest home, a husband who smelled of soap and pine, perhaps a child or two. But when she opened them again, there was only the road and the creak of wagon wheels and the growing ache in her chest. That night they stopped by a riverbank. The driver lit a small fire and fell asleep almost instantly. Clara sat awake, staring into the flames, her heart heavy. She took out her mother's locket and whispered, "For strength," as though saying the words aloud might summon it. She didn't yet know what kind of man waited for her at the end of this journey, whether he would be cruel or kind, whether he would see her as wife or prisoner. All she knew was that by this time tomorrow, she would belong to someone she had never met, in a world that did not speak her name. As the firelight flickered over her pale face, the prairie wind carried a faint, distant sound, drums echoing far off in the dark hills. Clara shivered and pulled her shawl tighter. Somewhere out there her future waited, silent and unreadable, and for the first time, she wondered if being sold into marriage might not be her end, but the beginning of something neither she nor her father could yet understand. The sun had barely lifted above the Kansas horizon when Clara rose from her uneasy sleep. The prairie air was cold, sharp against her skin, and for a moment she forgot where she was, until she saw the driver rolling up his blanket and the wagon waiting like a silent judge. The realization settled heavy on her chest. Today was the day she would leave Kansas for good. Her father stood by the barn when the wagon returned to the homestead. He looked smaller than she remembered, swallowed by the vastness of their failing land. The dry wind tugged at his coat, making him look like a man about to blow away with the dust. Clara climbed down, her boots sinking into the hard earth, and felt the sting of tears that refused to fall. She wanted to run to him, to cling to him as she had when she was a child frightened by thunderstorms, but she didn't move. She had promised herself she would face this with dignity. If she could not choose her life, she could at least choose her pride. Her father cleared his throat. "I packed your mother's Bible," he said, "and some preserves for the road. Mr. Raleigh said it's nearly a week's travel south to their camp. You'll be safe with his men." Clara nodded, unable to trust her voice. "I wish there was another way," he went on. "I truly do." She wanted to ask him, "Then why didn't you find one?" But the words caught in her throat. What good would anger do now? Their debt to the trading post owner was more than money. It was survival itself, seed, tools, credit. And when Raleigh had suggested the arrangement, her father had been too desperate, too worn down to refuse. Clara turned her gaze toward the far fields. Once she had dreamed of planting them with wildflowers, of bringing color back to the dusty land her mother had loved. Now the horizon seemed endless and cruel. A few of the neighbors had come to see her off, Mrs. Holloway, the preacher's wife, and two young women from church who had once been her closest friends. Their eyes were filled with pity, though none dared speak it aloud. Mrs. Holloway pressed a hand to Clara's cheek. "You're a brave girl," she whispered. "You'll do what's right for your family." Clara forced a smile. "Bravery has nothing to do with it, ma'am. I'm only doing what's been asked of me." The woman flinched at her tone but said nothing more. The preacher had offered to hold a small blessing before her departure. They gathered in a loose circle near the barn, and he prayed in a trembling voice for her safety and her soul. His words, "that she may bring light to heathen hearts," and made Clara's stomach twist. She wanted to protest, to say she was not being sent as a missionary or a symbol of peace. She was being sent because she was a girl without power, because her father was poor, and because the world found it acceptable to trade women like cattle. When the prayer ended, silence fell. The driver hitched the horses, and Clara's father handed her a small bundle of letters tied with twine. "Your mother wrote these before she took sick," he said softly. "She wanted you to have them when you married, whoever he might be." Clara held the bundle to her chest, her throat tightening. "Thank you, Papa." He nodded but could not meet her eyes. When she climbed back onto the wagon seat, he reached up to touch her hand. His fingers were rough, calloused from years of work, but they trembled as he said, "I know you'll find kindness there, Clara. I have to believe that." The horses started forward before she could answer. The wheels creaked, the dust rose, and the distance between them widened with each step. Her father's figure blurred, then faded into the pale horizon until there was nothing left but the land and the wind. Clara turned her face away so the driver wouldn't see her tears. She didn't cry loudly. She had learned long ago that tears were a luxury. But her hands shook as she clutched the bundle of letters, the only part of her mother she had left besides the locket at her neck. As the wagon rolled on, she looked back once more. The homestead was a speck now, small and fragile against the endless sky. She whispered a farewell no one could hear. "Goodbye, Mama. Goodbye, Papa, whatever comes next. I will endure it." The wind swallowed her words, carrying them eastward, back to the farm that would never again be her home. Ahead of her lay a vast wilderness, untamed, unknown, and waiting. Somewhere in that wilderness was the man she had been promised to. She imagined his face, dark eyes, proud bearing, the wildness she had been taught to fear. But beneath her fear, a strange curiosity stirred. Who was this man named Taza, and why did fate in all its cruelty choose to bind her to him? Clara did not yet know that the answer to that question would change not only her life, but the fragile truce between two worlds. The wagon rolled into Apache territory 3 days later, just as the sun began to fall behind the jagged red hills. The air grew different there, drier, sharper, laced with the scent of sagebrush and smoke. Clara sat stiffly on the seat beside the driver, her bonnet dusty, her hands raw from gripping the edge of the bench. Each jolt of the road reminded her how far she was from everything she had known. Nearly there, the driver grunted, squinting toward the distant rise. Camp's just beyond that ridge. Don't speak unless spoken to. They don't take kindly to nerves. Clara pressed her lips together. Her heart drummed so loudly she thought it might betray her. She wasn't sure what terrified her more. The stories she had heard of Apache warriors or the thought of being stared at like a prize no one wanted to claim. When they crested the hill, the camp came into view, a circle of lodges made of poles and hides, smoke curling lazily from their tops. Horses grazed near the creek. Children chased one another, their laughter rising and falling like birdsong. It wasn't the fierce war scene she had imagined. It was a village alive with ordinary life. Still, when the wagon rattled into the clearing, every sound seemed to stop. The children froze mid-game. A group of women paused their work with hides and turned to watch. Men emerged from their lodges, tall, silent, proud. Clara's stomach twisted under their steady gazes. A man stepped forward. He was taller than the others, his hair bound in a single braid, his chest bare except for a string of turquoise beads that caught the light. His eyes were dark and unreadable, and when he moved it was with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. "That's him," the driver muttered. Taza approached the wagon slowly, his expression calm but not welcoming. He spoke first to one of the older men in his own tongue, words that flowed like water, low and rhythmic. Then he turned to the driver. "You bring the woman?" His English was careful, the accent thick but clear. The driver nodded. "Clara Whitmore, from Kansas, the one Mr. Raleigh promised." Taza's gaze shifted to her. For a long moment he said nothing. Clara forced herself not to look away. She had been told to lower her eyes, to act humble, but something in his steady calm made her hold his gaze instead. He didn't look cruel. If anything, there was a strange sadness in his eyes, as though he too were measuring the cost of this arrangement. Finally he spoke, his voice low and even. "You are far from your home." Clara swallowed hard. "Yes, sir," she managed. Her throat felt dry as dust. He tilted his head slightly, studying her as though trying to see beneath her fear. "My people wait to eat," he said. "You will rest. Tomorrow we speak." It wasn't a command barked with authority, more an instruction given without room for refusal. Still, there was no mockery in his tone. He turned and spoke to a woman nearby who stepped forward and gestured for Clara to follow. The woman, perhaps in her 30s, had kind eyes and a long scar across one cheek. She introduced herself in halting English as Atsa, Taza's sister. She led Clara to a small tent near the edge of camp, not a prison but clearly separate from the others. "You stay here," Atsa said. "No fear, you safe." Clara nodded, clutching her shawl. She tried to offer thanks, but the words stumbled out. Atsa only smiled faintly and touched her arm before leaving. When Clara sat alone in the tent, the sounds of the camp returned. Drums, laughter, the crackle of fire. Through the opening she saw the Apache people gathered in a circle, sharing food, their faces glowing in the firelight. She watched Taza among them, speaking little, listening much. He seemed respected yet apart, like a man bearing a weight no one else could see. The driver had already gone. His task was done. The realization that she was truly alone struck Clara like a cold wind. She pulled her mother's locket from beneath her dress and held it tight. "For strength." The words echoed in her mind. Outside, a night wind stirred the flap of her tent. She thought she heard the sound of a flute, soft, mournful, unlike anything she'd ever known. It wasn't threatening, it was human. Clara's fear didn't vanish, but it shifted, from dread of savages to something more complex, more uncertain. She did not understand these people, and they did not understand her. Yet as she watched Taza by the fire, something in her heart whispered that the stories she had been told were not the truth. Somewhere between the rhythm of the drums and the sadness in his eyes, Clara sensed that her life, whatever shape it was meant to take, had already begun to change. The morning of the wedding dawned with a red sun, the kind the settlers called a warning. To Clara, it felt like the sky itself was holding its breath. She had slept little in the night, her mind restless, haunted by the weight of what the day would bring. When Atsa entered her tent, the woman carried a folded dress of soft deerskin, embroidered with turquoise beads and faint traces of white paint. Clara ran her fingers over it, startled by its beauty. "For you," Atsa said. "You wear for ceremony." Clara hesitated. I don't have anything to give in return." Atsa shook her head gently. "You give respect. That is enough." With Atsa's help, Clara changed from her travel-worn dress into the new garment. The leather felt strange against her skin, warm, supple, unlike anything she had ever worn. Atsa brushed her hair and tied it back with a strip of blue cloth. When she handed Clara a small mirror, Clara barely recognized herself. The girl who had left Kansas looked fragile, almost ghostly. This reflection looked older, steadier, touched by something she could not name. When the drums began to sound outside, Atsa smiled. "It is time." Clara's hands trembled as she stepped into the open air. The entire village had gathered in a wide circle, the fire at its center burning high. Some settlers from the nearby trading post stood at the edge, uncomfortable in their dusty boots, whispering among themselves. Taza stood across from her, dressed in ceremonial paint, lines of white and red marking his brow and chest. Around his neck hung the same turquoise beads she had seen when they first met. His expression was solemn but not cold. When he looked at her, his gaze did not pierce. It steadied. An older man, whom she guessed to be a spiritual leader, began to speak in the Apache tongue. The rhythm of his voice was like the low hum of the earth itself. He sprinkled cornmeal onto the ground and made gestures toward the sun. The fire, the four directions. Clara understood nothing of the words, but the meaning was clear. They were invoking balance and of man and woman, of earth and sky, of peace between two worlds. She expected that at some point she would be asked to kneel, to bow her head, to submit. That was what the trader had told her. That was what she had prepared herself to endure. But then, the old man fell silent and all eyes turned to Taza. He stepped forward slowly, his shadow long in the firelight, and spoke in English so that the settlers and Clara would understand. "This woman has come from far. Her father gave his word and my people honor it. But no bond is true if it is made in fear." A ripple of murmur swept through both Apache and settler alike. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. Taza continued, his voice calm but strong. "I will not take her hand unless she gives it. The fire bears witness. The earth hears us. If she chooses to walk beside me, she does so freely. If not, she will go unharmed." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Clara could feel the eyes of everyone around her. The disbelief of the white men, the quiet respect of the Apache, Atsa's faint, knowing smile. The trader, Raleigh, coughed uncomfortably. "That wasn't part of the agreement," he muttered. Taza ignored him. He turned his gaze to Clara, and for the first time since she had arrived, he smiled. Not widely, but softly, like sunlight breaking through clouds. "You have been taken from your home," he said quietly. "But this is your life now. I do not want a woman who is forced. I want one who chooses." Clara's breath caught. No one had ever asked her what she wanted. Not her father, not the preacher, not even the men who signed her name to a marriage she hadn't agreed to. The fire cracked, sending a shower of sparks into the darkening sky. She thought of her mother's voice reading scripture at night. "Love is patient, love is kind. It does not insist on its own way." Her throat tightened. She looked at Taza, at the steadiness in his gaze, the quiet strength there. Then, without quite meaning to, she stepped forward and placed her hand in his. The crowd murmured. Surprise, disbelief, even awe. But Taza only nodded once, then turned back to the old man. The ceremony continued, short and dignified. They exchanged gifts. She offered her mother's locket, which Taza touched reverently but returned, saying softly, "Keep what holds your heart." In turn, he placed around her neck a turquoise pendant shaped like a rising sun. When the final words were spoken and the drums began to beat again, Clara realized her fear had shifted into something new. Not love. Not yet, but respect. The settlers looked uneasy. The Apache smiled faintly. And as Taza guided her toward the fire to join the feast, the night air shimmered with a strange, unspoken truth. This was not the wedding anyone had expected. The drums still echoed through the valley when the ceremony ended, low and steady like the heartbeat of the earth. Clara stood beside Taza as the firelight painted their faces in shifting gold. She felt dizzy, not from fear this time, but from the sheer strangeness of what had just happened. No one had expected it. Not the white traders who had come to witness, not even the Apache elders who had agreed to this union for peace. A bride choosing her husband, and especially a white woman choosing an Apache man, was something no one had imagined possible. Yet Clara had done it. Her hand still tingled from where it had rested in his. The air was filled with murmurs. The settlers lingered at the edges of the circle, whispering among themselves. Clara caught fragments of their words. Savages playing games. Witchcraft and wits all a show. The women clutched their shawls tighter, as though her choice might stain them somehow. But the Apache seemed calm. They did not stare or sneer. Instead, they began to pass around bowls of food. Roasted venison, corn, beans. The scent filled the air, rich and comforting. Clara's stomach twisted with hunger, but she stood frozen, unsure what to do. Taza noticed. He reached for one of the bowls and handed it to her. "Eat," he said simply. Clara hesitated, then accepted it. She tasted the food, warm, smoky, seasoned with something she couldn't name. The first bite loosened something inside her, a quiet crack in the wall of her fear. Taza turned to the crowd then, speaking in his native tongue. His words were firm but calm, and as he spoke, the people listened in perfect silence. When he finished, he looked back toward the settlers, and then did something that made the entire gathering fall still. He stepped forward into the open space near the fire and slowly laid his weapons down. His knife, his bow, his hatchet. The gesture was deliberate, ceremonial. Then, without breaking eye contact with the onlookers, he said in English, "No man owns a woman. Not by trade. Not by blood. The fire sees us equal." The murmurs swelled again, disbelief, outrage, awe. Rawly, the traitor, sputtered. "Now see here, Taza. That ain't how these things work. A deal's a deal." Her father. Taza cut him off with a calmness that chilled more than anger could have. Her father gave his word. I give mine. But my word says she stands beside me, not beneath. Clara's breath caught. The world seemed to tilt. She had never heard a man speak like that. Not in her church. Not in her town. Not even in her own home. Then Taza turned toward her once more, holding something in his hand, and a delicate necklace of turquoise and silver. He approached slowly, each step measured. "This was my mother's," he said quietly. "She wore it when she was made wife to my father. It means the rising sun, life, strength, balance." He looked down at the necklace, then up at Clara. "If you wear it, it means we walk the same path. Not one behind the other." She didn't know what to say. Her throat tightened. The crowd was utterly silent, the fire crackling like the only voice in the world. Finally, she nodded. "Then, yes," she whispered. Taza lifted the necklace and placed it gently around her neck. The metal was cool against her skin, and for a moment time seemed to still. The Apache let out a low hum, a sound of respect. But the settlers remained motionless, caught between outrage and confusion. Raleigh muttered something under his breath about playing at civilization, then turned away, clearly angry that his show of dominance had turned into something he couldn't control. Taza ignored him completely. He looked back to the circle and raised one hand toward the fire. "Let the sun remember," he said. "Tonight there is peace. Not because it was forced, but because it was chosen." Atsa began to sing then, a soft, lilting melody that rose above the wind. The other women joined her, their voices weaving together into something ancient and beautiful. Clara stood motionless, her heart aching in her chest. She didn't fully understand the words, but she could feel their meaning. It wasn't a song of victory. It was a song of beginning. For the first time since leaving Kansas, Clara felt the tightness in her chest ease. The fear didn't vanish. It lingered like a ghost at the edge of her thoughts, but beneath it was something new. A flicker of hope. When the song ended, Taza turned to her and spoke softly. "You are tired. Tomorrow I will show you the river." She nodded. "Thank you." He inclined his head, not like a conqueror, but like an equal, and walked away into the shadows, leaving her alone by the fire. Clara touched the turquoise necklace at her throat, feeling the steady beat of her heart beneath it. Around her, the camp was alive with quiet laughter, with music, with life. And as the moon rose high over the red hills, Clara understood that the moment she had feared, her wedding to a stranger, had become something entirely unexpected. She had not been taken. She had been seen. The days after the ceremony unfolded slowly, like the turning of pages in a book Clara could not yet read. The Apache camp woke with the sunrise, children's laughter echoing through the air, women grinding maize, men preparing horses for hunting. Life moved with rhythm, not hurry, and though she was now, by all customs, Taza's wife, Clara found herself living as something more like a guest, or perhaps a ghost hovering at the edge of this new world. Taza had given her a small tent of her own near the river. It was simple but sturdy, the ground lined with soft furs, a clay pot for water, and a woven blanket so warm it surprised her. Every morning Atza came by with food, sometimes berries, sometimes a bit of bread baked in ash. Clara tried to help, but Atza would shake her head gently and say, "Soon. First you rest. You learn." Taza himself did not visit often. He rose before dawn and returned late, his clothes dusted with earth, his eyes tired. When he saw her, he would nod politely, sometimes ask if she had eaten. He spoke little and always with quiet respect. At first, Clara mistook that distance for coldness. She had imagined a husband, even one not of her choosing, would demand her company, her obedience, her body. But Taza did none of that. He kept his distance as if he feared to frighten her. It was disorienting. She had prepared herself to be taken, not to be left alone. The nights were hardest. The wind whistled through the canyon, carrying the voices of the camp, laughter, song, the barking of dogs. Clara lay awake beneath her blanket, staring at the shifting shadows on the tent's walls. She would touch the turquoise pendant at her throat, feeling its cool weight, and whisper to herself, for strength, as she had since the day she left Kansas. One night, unable to sleep, she stepped outside. The moon was high and white, lighting the world in silver. She saw Taza sitting by the dying embers of the central fire alone. He was sharpening a knife, his movements slow and deliberate. She hesitated, then gathered her courage and walked closer. He looked up when she approached, surprise flickering across his face. "You cannot sleep?" She shook her head. "It's too quiet," she admitted, though the truth was that the silence made her think too much. He smiled faintly, the smallest curve of his mouth. "You will learn to like quiet. The land speaks when all else is still." They sat without speaking for a while, the fire crackling between them. Clara stole glances at him when she thought he wouldn't notice, at the way the firelight caught the lines of his face, the steadiness in his eyes. Finally, she said softly, "You could have made me obey you. No one here would have stopped you." Taza's knife paused mid-motion. He looked at her for a long moment, then set it down. "If I take what is not freely given," he said quietly, "I make myself a thief. I would rather wait and be poor." His words struck her like a wind she hadn't expected, gentle but powerful. No man had ever spoken to her that way, not even her father, who had loved her in his own weary way. She didn't know how to respond. Instead, she looked toward the dark hills and said, "In Kansas, they said you people take what you want. They said you were dangerous." Taza's gaze didn't waver. "Some of my people are dangerous," he said evenly. "So are yours." The honesty in his voice left no room for argument. She nodded slowly, understanding more in his silence than in any sermon she had ever heard. When the fire burned low, Taza rose. "You should rest. Tomorrow you will help Atza with the children. They must learn your words. You will learn ours." She smiled faintly. "You mean I'll be teaching and learning at the same time?" He gave a short laugh, the first she'd heard from him. "Yes, that is the way of all good teachers." As he walked away into the shadows, Clara realized that the space between them, this careful, deliberate distance, was not emptiness. It was respect. Over the next days, their paths crossed more often. She watched him speak to his people, his calm authority commanding without force. She saw him mend a child's toy bow, help an elder gather wood, and offer food before taking any for himself. The settlers had told her Apache men were cruel, proud, untamable. But she saw something else entirely. Still, he did not come to her tent at night. He did not touch her hand unless necessary. And yet, when their eyes met across the fire or over a shared task, there was something unspoken, a quiet awareness that words could not name. One evening, Atza said with a knowing smile, "You think he keeps away because he does not care, but you do not see. He keeps away because he does." Clara turned the thought over in her mind long after Atza left. The words felt heavy with truth. For the first time since the wagon had carried her away from Kansas, Clara began to breathe without fear. She still missed home, still longed for her mother's voice, but tea. Autumn deepened across the valley, turning the cottonwoods by the river into splashes of gold. The air grew crisp, scented with smoke and sage. Clara had been among the Apache for nearly 2 months now, and though her heart still sometimes longed for home, the edges of her fear had worn smooth. At first, the days had passed in a haze of confusion, strange customs, a language she didn't understand, the watchful eyes of people who didn't yet know what to make of her. But slowly, the camp began to accept her, and she began to see their world not as wild or savage, but as astonishingly ordered, filled with a grace her upbringing had never prepared her to see. Each morning she rose with the first light. The women gathered to grind maize or tan hides, and Atsa always saved a place for her. Clara's hands, once soft from books and sewing, grew rough and capable. She learned to stretch and scrape the hides, to weave reeds into baskets, to listen to the rhythm of work that carried its own quiet music. Language came next. At first it was impossible. The words slipped through her like water. But the children laughed as they tried to teach her, pointing, giggling when she mispronounced a sound. She would chase them, mock scolding, and their laughter made her laugh too. One little boy, Nantan, became her favorite. He was Atsa's son, mischievous and bright-eyed. He called her Nita, bear cub, because, as he said, she was small but stubborn. The name caught on, and soon everyone in the village used it. The first time Taza called her Nita, his voice soft with amusement, she felt warmth bloom in her chest. One afternoon, Atsa brought her to the river. "We wash the deer hides," she explained, gesturing for Clara to kneel. The water was cold and fast, numbing her hands. As they worked, Atsa began to speak, half in broken English, half in Apache. She told Clara stories of her mother, who had been a healer, of the war that had taken her brother, of the white men who had brought both sickness and iron rails through their lands. Clara listened in silence, guilt heavy in her heart. She had grown up hearing only one version of those stories, the ones where the settlers were heroes. But as she looked at Atsa's calm face, at the strength in her hands, she felt her understanding begin to fracture and rebuild itself anew. That evening, as the fire burned low, Taza came to where Clara sat mending one of her dresses. His shadow fell across the ground before her. "You learn fast," he said. She smiled. "I have good teachers." He nodded, then sat nearby, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "When I was small, my father made me sit by the river each morning," he said quietly. "He told me to listen. I thought it was foolish. But now I understand. The river speaks. It teaches patience." Clara looked at him, surprised by his openness. "What does it say?" He glanced at her then, the corners of his mouth lifting just slightly. "That no stone can stop it forever." She didn't answer, but she understood. The river had worn her down, too. Her pride, her anger, her fear. Bit by bit, the walls inside her were eroding. Over the following weeks, Taza began to include her in small parts of his world. He took her riding one morning, showing her how to guide a horse without reins, only with pressure and voice. She clung to the animal's mane at first, terrified, but Taza's calm voice steadied her. "Breathe with the horse," he said. "If you fear, it fears." When she finally found her balance and the horse moved beneath her like a living rhythm, she laughed out loud, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in months. Taza's own laughter joined hers, low and full of life. After that, the people began to smile at her more openly. She was no longer just the white bride. She was Nita, the small, stubborn woman who worked, learned, and laughed among them. Still, not everything was easy. Some of the older women whispered when they saw her and Taza together. A few of the younger men looked at her with unease, suspicious of her presence. Even among the settlers who came to trade, rumors grew that she had gone native, that she'd been bewitched. Clara heard the whispers, but she no longer let them shape her. What mattered were the quiet moments, Atsa humming while they worked, Nantan running to show her a carved toy, Taza's voice at dusk, low and steady as the river's song. One evening, As the sky turned violet, Clara sat by her tent and watched the stars emerge. Taza joined her, wordless at first. Then, after a long silence, he said, "You are not afraid anymore." She looked up at him. "No," she said softly. "Not of you, not of this place." He nodded. "Good." And though he said nothing more, Clara could feel it. The distance between them narrowing, not by force, but by the slow, patient hand of understanding. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, and the stars seemed to shimmer brighter, as if they too were learning her name. Winter crept across the valley in quiet whispers. Frost gathered along the riverbanks, and the mornings arrived pale and cold. The Apache people prepared as they always had, storing food, mending hides, repairing weapons. Life moved with steady rhythm. But beneath that rhythm, Clara began to sense an unease, a shadow that lingered at the edge of every conversation. Men spoke in low tones around the fires. Scouts rode out more often, their return marked by grim faces. Even Atsa's laughter grew rare. One evening, Clara found Taza sharpening his knife beneath the dim light of the moon. His expression was tight, his shoulders drawn. "What's wrong?" she asked. He hesitated before answering. "Settlers," he said. "From the north. They took horses from a nearby camp. Some were killed trying to get them back." Clara felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. "Will they come here?" Taza's eyes flicked to hers. "Maybe. The white soldiers say we must move again, farther south." "But this is your home," she whispered. He nodded once, slowly. "It has been for many generations, but the land does not stay ours just because we love it." She wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't fair, but the words died in her throat. Fairness was a word she had stopped believing in long ago. That night the camp was restless. Dogs barked at unseen things, and Clara dreamed of fire and thunder, of wagons burning, of cries in the dark. When she awoke, her heart was pounding, the sound of hooves echoing in her memory. The next morning, Taza gathered the men. Clara watched from the edge of the circle as he spoke, his voice strong but calm. He gave instructions: to hide food, to prepare to move, to keep the women and children close to the river. When he finished, he turned to her. "You will go with Atsa," he said. "If trouble comes, you go east. Do not wait for me." Clara shook her head before she could stop herself. "No, I won't leave you." His gaze hardened. "You will." "That is my word." She met his eyes, anger and fear mixing in her chest. "And mine is that I'll stay." For a long moment he said nothing. Then finally the corner of his mouth twitched in something that was almost a smile. "You are stubborn, Nita." "Bear cub," she said, recalling the meaning. "Remember?" He nodded, and for a heartbeat the tension broke. But behind his eyes, she could still see the storm gathering. 2 days later, scouts returned with grim news. A band of armed settlers, not soldiers but ranchers and drifters, was moving toward the valley. They blamed the Apache for the theft of cattle and horses. There would be no parley. When the alarm spread through the camp, panic followed. Women gathered their children, men prepared bows and rifles, the air filled with the scent of smoke and fear. Clara helped Atsa pack food and blankets, her hands shaking. "This is madness," she whispered. "They'll be killed. For what?" Atsa's eyes were hard. For being here, for not leaving when told. As dusk fell, Taza returned, dust on his face, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "They are close," he said simply. "We will not run. We defend the camp." Clara stepped forward. "Then I'll help." He frowned. "You are not a fighter." "No," she said. "But I'm your wife." That silenced him. Around them, the camp hummed with movement. Men preparing positions, women tending to the old and the sick. In the midst of that chaos, Taza studied her face, searching for fear, but what he found instead was resolve. "Stay near the fire," he said finally. "If anything happens, take the children and go to the river." Clara nodded, though she had no intention of leaving him. That night, the hills glowed faintly under the rising moon. The air was too still, too quiet. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the crackle of the fire, seemed to carry a warning. Clara sat near the center of camp, holding Nantan close as he slept. Atsa stood guard beside her hand gripping a knife, and then, the first gunshot. It split the night open. Horses screamed, men shouted. The air filled with the thunder of gunfire and the acrid stench of smoke. Taza's voice rose above the chaos, shouting orders in Apache, calm even in the storm. Clara's heart pounded as she huddled by the fire, clutching the boy to her chest. She could see flashes of movement, shadows of men running, the flare of rifles in the dark. Someone shouted her name, "Nita!" And she turned just in. Time to see Taza sprint toward her, his face streaked with ash and sweat. "Go!" he shouted. "To the river!" She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "Not without you!" But before he could answer, another shot rang out, closer this time, and he fell to his knees. The world seemed to freeze. The firelight flickered over his body, the sound of battle fading to a distant roar. Clara screamed his name and ran forward through the smoke. And though the night burned around her, one thought burned brighter still. She had promised not to leave him, and she would not break that promise now. The smoke clung to the night like a ghost. Shouts echoed through the canyon, the stench of gunpowder mixing with the bitter scent of burning wood. The camp that had once been filled with laughter now roared with chaos. The sharp cries of the wounded, the thundering of horses, the crack of rifles. Clara stumbled through the haze, her lungs burning, calling Taza's name. "Taza!" Her voice was nearly swallowed by the noise, but she saw him then, crumpled near the fire pit, his rifle lying a few feet away. His hand pressed against his side, dark blood seeping between his fingers. She dropped to her knees beside him, her trembling hands reaching for him. "Taza, no, please look at me." His eyes fluttered open, steady even through the pain. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice strained. Clara shook her head fiercely. "I told you, I won't leave you." He tried to smile, but it twisted into a grimace. "Then, you're a fool, Nita." "Maybe I am," she whispered, tears streaking through the soot on her cheeks. "But I'm your fool." Around them, the battle surged and ebbed. The Apache warriors moved with fierce precision, pushing back the raiders in bursts of flame and fury. Clara could hear Atsa shouting commands somewhere behind her, and the wail of a child carried through the night. She pressed her hand over Taza's wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "You'll be all right," she murmured, though the lie trembled on her lips. He shook his head weakly. "Do not waste your tears. I have lived as I wished, free. If I die tonight, it is with honor." "No," she said fiercely. "You'll live because I need you to." For a moment their eyes met, hers wild with fear, his calm with a strange peace. Then a sound cut through the chaos, a shout in English. "There, by the fire." Two men burst from the shadows, rifles in hand. Their faces were grim, smeared with dust. One of them froze when he saw Clara, recognition flaring in his eyes. "Lord above," he muttered. "It's her, the mail-order bride. They said you were taken." Clara rose, shielding Taza with her body. "Don't shoot," she cried. "He's not your enemy." The man hesitated, glancing at his companion. "He's an Apache, miss. You get away from him before you get yourself killed." "I'm not going anywhere," she shouted, her voice cracking. "He's my husband." The words hung between them, heavy and unbelievable. The younger man raised his rifle anyway. "Then you're lost, too." But before he could fire, an arrow whistled through the air and striking him square in the shoulder. He fell back with a cry, his weapon dropping into the dirt. The other man turned to flee, but Taza, somehow still conscious, lifted his rifle, steadied it with shaking hands, and fired. The shot echoed through the canyon, and silence fell for a heartbeat before the fighting roared to life again in the distance. Clara turned back to him, her heart hammering. "Taza, please don't close your eyes. Stay with me." He looked up at her, the corners of his lips curving faintly. "You are strong, Nita. Stronger than you know." She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it hard against his wound. "You're going to be fine," she whispered. "You'll see." We'll leave this place if we have to. We'll find peace. He reached up, his blood-stained fingers brushing her cheek. Peace, he murmured, his eyes dimming. Maybe not here, but someday. No. Her tears fell onto his hand. Not someday. With me, now. Then a sudden noise behind her. She spun around, knife in hand, but it was Atsa, her face streaked with smoke. Clara, she shouted. The fight is over. They're gone. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps. The night was eerily quiet now, save for the distant moans of the injured. Atsa dropped to her knees beside them. He's hurt bad? I know, Clara whispered. Help me carry him, please. Together they lifted Taza, half dragging, half carrying him toward the river where the wounded were being tended. The cold water shimmered in the moonlight, and the women laid him down on a bed of furs. Clara stayed beside him all through the night, refusing to rest. She washed his wound, whispered prayers she hadn't said in years, sang softly in English, old hymns her mother used to hum. When dawn finally broke, pale and trembling, the fighting was over. The settlers had fled, leaving behind only their dead and the echo of gunfire, and Taza, still breathing. Weak but alive, when his eyes opened again, they met hers, full of quiet wonder. You stayed, Clara smiled through tears. I told you I don't run from what's mine. He reached for her hand, his fingers cool against hers. Then you have my life, Nita. It belongs to you now. She bent forward, pressing her forehead to his. No, she whispered. We belong to each other. The river whispered beside them, carrying away the blood and the ashes of the night. The first light of morning touched their faces, two souls bound not by fear or duty, but by something neither of them had expected to find in the ashes of war. Love. Winter passed slowly that year. The valley that had once echoed with gunfire was now hushed beneath a blanket of snow. Smoke rose from the Apache lodges, carrying the scent of cedar and healing herbs. Life had returned, quieter but not broken. Taza's recovery was long and uncertain. The bullet had passed cleanly through his side, but the fever that followed nearly took him. For days, Clara sat at his bedside, feeding him broth, changing bandages, whispering words of comfort in both English and the few Apache phrases she had learned. Sometimes, he drifted into fever dreams, murmuring in his language, names she didn't know, memories of battles and lost kin. But whenever he woke, the first thing he saw was her face. You are still here, he would say weakly, and she would smile. I told you I'm stubborn. By the time the snows melted and the first buds appeared along the riverbanks, Taza could walk again. Slowly, carefully, the people treated him as one who had returned from the edge, half in this world, half beyond. They called him Taza Chidi, the one who endured. For Clara, those months changed something deep inside her. The woman who had arrived on a wagon, frightened and resentful, no longer existed. She had become part of this land, woven into its rhythm. The people no longer called her the white woman. She was Nita, the bear cub, fierce, loyal, one of them. Spring brought new life. Children chased each other through the grass, and laughter returned to the camp. Clara began teaching English to the younger ones, using the same books she had carried all the way from Kansas, tattered, smoke-scented, but still whole. In return, they taught her their words, their songs. One afternoon, as she sat by the river washing clothes, Taza came to her. His limp was still slight, his movement slower than before, but his eyes were strong again. You work too hard, he said, crouching beside her. She smiled without looking up. I had a good teacher. He dipped his hands into the cold water, splashing her lightly. You mean Atsa, she laughed, shaking her head. No, I meant you. For a long moment they worked in silence, the river murmuring between them. Then Taza reached into his pocket and drew out something small. It was a ring, rough, carved from bone, polished smooth by hand. This, he said softly, was my mother's. She wore it when she married my father. He carved it for her from the first deer he hunted. Clara's hands trembled as she took it. It's beautiful, he nodded. Now it is yours, her throat tightened. But we were already... Yes, he said, his voice gentle. We were married by my people. But this is for you, for your way. Tears blurred her vision as he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had always been meant for her. In that moment, she understood something profound. Love did not belong to one world or one language. It grew wherever two hearts dared to meet halfway. The following weeks brought visits from traders and travelers. News spread that the government planned to move the remaining Apache to a reservation farther south. Many would have to go, but Taza refused. "This land is our heart," he said. "We stay." Some of the elders agreed, some did not. But for Taza and Clara, there was no debate. They had already built their life here, their home by the river, where the cottonwoods swayed and the wind sang through the canyon. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Clara stood outside their tent watching smoke curl into the sky. Taza joined her, his arm wrapping gently around her shoulders. "You miss your people sometimes," he said quietly. It was not a question. She nodded. "Sometimes. But then I remember, my people are here now," he smiled, pressing his forehead to hers. "Then we are both home." The stars rose above them, clear and sharp. Somewhere in the distance an owl called, the night's soft blessing. Clara leaned into him, her hand resting over the ring on her finger. She thought of the girl she had been, the frightened 19-year-old who had been forced onto a wagon, who had believed her life was ending. She could never have imagined this ending, or rather, this beginning. In the years that followed, stories of Taza Chidi and Nita spread across the plains. The Apache warrior who spared his white bride, and the woman who stayed when she could have run. Some told it as legend, others as warning. But those who had seen them together by the river, laughing as the wind carried the scent of sage and rain, knew it was neither. It was a story of two souls and born from different worlds, yet bound by the same heartbeat, who had chosen love in a place where love had no reason to survive. And when the dawn came each day, washing the land in gold, it was said that if you listened closely, you could hear the river whispering their names, Taza, Nita, forever bound by choice, by courage, and by the wild, untamed grace of the land they called home.